Hello, my name is Hallie, and welcome to this review where we will assess the organization of the brain. We will begin by identifying the divisions of the brain, and then we'll focus our attention on the more primitive portions of the brain, which are essential for our daily activities. Things like sleep, heartbeat, respiration, and then we will also assess the techniques that were used to identify the functions of the various regions of the brain. And by completing this review, we'll have a better ability to associate the anatomical regions of our brain with their roles in our daily lives. And we'll be able to evaluate questions like the one at the bottom of the screen, which asks us to pair the regions of the brain with their function. This is a diagram of our embryonic brain, and this is a helpful tool because we can see that as our brain develops, there are three main regions. There's the prosencephalon, which is the forebrain, the mesencephalon, the midbrain, and the rhombencephalon, the hindbrain. For the purposes of the MCAT, knowing that it is the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain is sufficient. You may also notice that the forebrain is further divided into the telecephalon and the diencephalon, and the hindbrain is divided into the metacephalon and myelencephalon. Now these words can be a little bit intimidating, but for the purposes of the MCAT, all you really need to be able to do is recognize that any word that ends in the suffix cephalon is associated with the brain. Now, evolutionarily speaking, the part of the brain that's the closest to the spinal cord is going to be responsible for our most basic functions that are essential for life, because that part of the brain is what evolved first. So with that in mind, remember that the hindbrain is associated with our most basic functions like motor coordination and breathing. The midbrain is a little more specialized, and this is responsible for our sensory and motor reflexes, and then the forebrain is the most highly specialized part of our brain and is responsible for the characteristics that we associate with being unique to human nature, such as intellect and ability to process emotions. There are three regions of the hindbrain that we want to remember for our MCAT. The first being the pons, which helps to relay information from the spinal cord to the appropriate part of the brain and also regulates sleep. It's nice to remember that we prefer to sleep upon the bed. The medulla oblongata is essential for survival, and it's useful to remember that on test day that we got to breathe. Lastly, we want to identify that the cerebellum is also an important part of the hindbrain, and this is very important in coordination of our body movements. And for test day, it might be helpful to remember the function of the cerebellum by remembering that Bella is all about balance. And interesting note, alcohol actually inhibits the cerebellum. In the midbrain, note that there's the superior colliculus, which receives visual sensory input, and the inferior colliculus, which receives auditory input. And it might be helpful for test day to know that the mnemonic Superman has superior vision to help us remember that the superior colliculus is what's responsible for relaying visual sensory input. There were some important techniques that were used to identify the functions of each region of the brain. Certainly animal model studies played a huge role. We could take an animal model, expose the brain, and then either ablate or electrically stimulate portions of the brain that we normally wouldn't be able to study on a human test subject for ethical reasons. For instance, the deeper portions of the brain that are essential for life. Electrode stimulation is another great technique where we can actually remove part of the skull on an alert patient and then use electric probes to stimulate specific parts of the brain and elicit a response. And depending on where the probe is placed on the brain, we can elicit activity from the subject, such as eliciting a memory or sensory information like hot or cold. Electroencephalograms, or EEG, were also great in helping us to map the brain. Basically, an EEG is a cap with many different electrodes on it that can be placed on a subject's head and then record their global brain activity. For example, if you have ever done shadowing experience in a hospital, you may remember that certain patients were having their brain activity monitored for various reasons, and this would have been done through the use of EEG. Another technique was regional cerebral blood flow, or RCBF. And the concept behind RCBF is that if we ask a subject to perform a specific activity, let's say, for example, listening to music, we would expect that the person would have a diversion of blood flow to a specific region of the brain that's responsible for processing that stimuli. And we can visualize where the blood is being diverted to through soft tissue imaging. With the information in this review, we can now pair the regions of the brain with their activity, such as the question presented here. And the correct answer is B. We prefer to sleep on a bed. We can also predict how a person's behavior may change in response to damage on a specific part of the brain, such as this question. And the correct answer is C. The cerebellum is associated with coordination, and certainly skiing down a mountain would be very difficult if our balance or our coordination was not 100%. The key points to remember for test day is that the hindbrain, which is located closest to the spinal cord, is going to have the most primitive functions and be essential for survival, while the midbrain is a little more specialized and helps us to relay sensory information, and the forebrain, being the most specialized, will be responsible for everything that we associate with being human, such as cognitive and behavioral processing. And then brain mapping is a series of techniques that were used to help us identify the functions of each region of the brain. Well, congratulations on completing this review. Having a better understanding of the organization of our brain, as well as the techniques used to identify the functions of the regions, will be important knowledge to know for test day. Thank you for joining me, and as always, best of luck on your exam.